Welcome, students. I'm going to give you a brief overview of genre and criteria of excellence in children's literature. So first, just to quickly talk about it, there's a difference between format versus genre. Picture books, poetry, and graphic novels are formats of books, which can come in different genres, which I will explore a little bit further. So picture books across the genres, description of the format. The illustrations are of equal or greater importance as the text, if in any presenting the meaning, based on format rather than content, strong unity between text and art. Look for interesting words used in interesting ways, ideas and concepts accessible to the audience that it's written for, artistic excellence regardless of a medium or style. Now, the thing with picture books is there can be a picture book with no words, with no writing, but there cannot be a picture book with writing and no pictures. And there's a difference between an illustrated book and a picture book, which we will get more into in class, but a picture book needs to be over 50% pictures and illustrations for it to count as a picture book. An illustrated book, where it just has little pictures in the corner, is not considered a picture book. So then we have poetry. Now, poetry can also be a format because it could come in nonfiction. Like on the top, there's a picture book about different kinds of dinosaurs, which is completely nonfiction. And then there's another poetry picture book about different kinds of animals. And Swirl by Swirl is about also a nonfiction picture book in poetry form about the environment. But it is also can be nonfiction and narrative nonfiction, as it is in the picture book Meet Danita Brown, and an anthology of different kinds of poems, which are nonfiction, which is the same case in Where the Sidewalk Ends. And one of the books we will be reading, which is narrative poetry, novel in verse, or verse novel, is Inside Out and Back Again, which it's a novel, but it's made of, poetry. It's a poetic novel. So we'll get more into that in class, but I wanted to quickly review that. So poetry and verse as a genre, if you're looking at it, is condensed language, varies in style, forming use of poetic devices, uses language to shape experience or idea into extraordinary thoughts. Look for interesting language used in interesting ways, fresh insights and visions. Ideas are meaningful for the audience. Another way of thinking of it is it's like condensed language. It's like a canned soup that everything is very, very precise. Even free verse is very precise. Every word means something. So, and we will again get into this in class, but it's something to think about while you're looking at books. Graphic novels also can vary in genre. The 9/11 report is literally the 9/11 report, but is illustrated through graphic various graphics. So it's completely nonfiction. Then we have Stitches, which is contemporary realistic fiction, which is about a little boy who, ends up having various dreams and weird things happening to him with X-ray machines and has a weird family. It's a complex book. Then we have The Amulet, which is fantasy that has, talking animals in it and various fantastic devices. And then we have Mouse, which could be, which is more biographical, where the author is writing about his father's experience in the Holocaust. Then we have Pride, which is about it's about the war in Iraq, but it's told through the story of a bunch of zoo animals. So it's on the border between realism and fantasy. It's more like an allegory. So a graphic novel is a format where it can have various kinds of genres. Now, genre also needs to be understood as a spectrum. So one of the most basic distinctions in literature for children is between fiction and nonfiction. Fiction, by definition, is something that is made up. Some fiction may seem real, but it is not. No matter how realistic it seems, it's something invented, an author's visions of realistic fantasy world. Author's job is to make it seem plausible and possible within the story world that he or she creates. Now, nonfiction is based on facts and theories, presents information that is real and verifiable by the reader. The task of the author is to be as truthful as possible based on what is known at the time of the writing of that particular text. So again, while it may seem like there's a clear line between nonfiction and fiction, there isn't. So if you look at the little spectrum I put together here, we have nonfiction on one side and fiction on the other side. So we have informational text, biography, biographical fiction, historical fiction. Because biographical fiction can be based on a real person but have fictional dramatizations in it. And historical fiction, the same thing. The difference between the two is biographical fiction is based more on the person, while historical fiction is based more on the time period, like an event of some kind. Then we have contemporary realistic fiction, which is completely fiction, completely made up, and not based on anything that's real. And then fantastic literature, which is a completely made up world with nobody real in it at all. But again, it's a spectrum. Sometimes things are blurry, and you can't really tell the difference of, is it nonfiction or is it fiction? And we will discuss that more. So we have folklore first. Folklore are stories that were passed down for generations by word of mouth before they were written down. Reflects values and beliefs of society, includes nursery rhymes, folk tales, fairy tales, epics, legends, folk songs. Look for language that reflects oral origins, language and illustrations representative of the cultural heritage of that tale. So folklore, many are fairy tales like Grimm's Tales, Little Red Riding Hood is definitely one. The Matchbox Girl, the Snow Queen, and then if we even think Disney, Cinderella, all of those go way back in time to oral folk tales. And as we explore different cultures, we'll see how those various kinds of stories actually, have situated or have grown out of various other cultures and changed, or have various different versions of themselves, which is interesting. Then we have fantasy. A fantasy is imaginative narratives that explore alternative realities, contain events that could not occur, characters who could not exist, and or places that could not exist. Ranges from talking animal picture storybooks to complex novels exploring universal truths. Look for a detailed setting, imaginative events, multidimensional characters, meaningful themes, all within a consistent logical framework. So many cartoons are fantasy. Talking animals are fantasy. Animals cannot talk. Winnie the Pooh is fantasy. So if there's a talking animal, if there's something that could not happen in our reality, that is fantasy. Now, what gets confusing is trying to tell the difference between fantasy and science fiction. Well, science fiction, imaginative narratives that explore scientific possibilities, ranges from simple to complex speculation about the impact of scientific advances. Look for logical and imaginative exploration of potential impact of science, well-developed characters, logical, engaging, and believable plot, meaningful theme. So science fiction, for instance, Star Trek. Star Trek is not fantasy. Star Trek, especially if you look back at the old versions, even before many of us were born, you see them, having flip phones and various computers that they didn't have back then, but we have them today. They were imagining scientific advances of exploring the universe. So it's science fiction. Everything in there was plausible. It could happen, just it couldn't happen at that time period. Telling the difference between these two genres can sometimes be complex, and sometimes there's even like blurred genres or mixed genres like science fantasy, which we'll explore in class. Contemporary realistic fiction, imaginative narratives set in modern time and events, character settings that could or do occur in the real world. Look for credible, complex, non-stereotypical characters, believable and understandable problems solved in a realistic way, meaningful themes, rich language. So drama out there, a lot of that is contemporary realistic fiction. Anything that is the fictionalized world that can happen today is contemporary realistic fiction. Minus reality TV, because reality TV is nonfiction. Well, it should be nonfiction. But anything like that you read that is about contemporary today, dealing with contemporary issues of today, is contemporary realistic fiction. The characters can seem extremely real. There's nothing, fantastical about it, but they're made up by the author, therefore it's fiction. Historical fiction, fictional narrative set in the past, portrays realistic events and characters, actual and or fictional. Historical accuracy look for, detailed authentic setting, well-developed characters who reflect historical setting, events that reflect the time and place, themes that are relevant to the time, setting, and characters. The most important thing for historical fiction is authentic setting, an authentic event. If you're watching, for instance, a lot of movies, like if they're about the Civil War or Band of Brothers, or if they're about like the Vietnam War, like those events being authentic is important. All those characters might not be real or even, have happened or whatever, but the events need to have occurred for it to be a good piece of historical fiction. Then we have biography, autobiography, and memoir, which are actually all very different. But we'll swish them together here and then we'll end up taking them apart during class. So biography, autobiography, memoir tells the story of the life or portion of life of an actual person written by the subject for autobiography and memoir, or by someone who knows about the subject, which is biography. So autobiography, auto meaning, self, written by the self, so they're written by yourself, and memoir, which is something that's also written by yourself. Difference between those two things is that memoir is based on memories, which does not have to be factually based. Autobiography needs to be grounded in the facts, and we will review that in class. Look for accuracy of a truthful recounting of life, interesting and accurate social details, multidimensional character who is not infallible, vivid and engaging writing. In addition to this, there's also biographical fiction, which is a lot like historical fiction, where there can be a focus on a real character, a real person, but the events around them may not be authentic, or there might be dramatized events that can't be necessarily looked up factually or be looked up as being accurate. So it's made up in that sense, but that person really did exist. Then we have nonfiction. So nonfiction, explanation of topics and concepts using facts and the real world. Many different styles, forms, and topics, as we saw before. It can come in many formats: graphic novel, poetry. Look for accuracy, qualified authors, documented resources, distinction between fact and theory, attractive supportive design, and enthusiastic style. When we get to nonfiction, we'll speak more about it, and we usually use the Orbis Pictus award criteria to look at nonfiction. And again, biography can be considered part of nonfiction. It depends on how truthful to the facts that biography is. So here we have some films I thought some of you might be, films and TV shows that I thought some of you might be familiar with. So the first thing, let's try to find March of the Penguins. So what is March of the Penguins? It's a documentary. It's a documenting penguins up in, taking care of their eggs, trying their normal everyday lives sort of thing. So there's nothing non-fictional about this. While they might have edited so it would have some sort of storyline, there's no, they're not talking, they're not doing anything that they can't normally do, so it's nonfiction. Then we get to Oliver Stone's JFK. Now we have to think back, this is the point where it gets blurry. JFK was a real person, he's a real biographical person. So is this a biography, or what else could this be? Because this film was very, the whole conspiracy theories about how JFK was murdered are within this, and Oliver Stone takes a certain point of view. So some people, would align themselves with Oliver Stone's point of view and say this is, true biography, while others would say it's biographical fiction. There's too many things in here that aren't documented truths, or there aren't documented facts. There's too many dramatizations here. Then we get something like The Tudors, which, if you watch, is completely historical fiction, to the point that the person that plays Henry, the original Henry, yes, he did have, wives that, several wives that he killed. Anne Boleyn was certainly a real person, but the dramatizations are incredibly, outlandishly unbelievable. And Henry did not look like that. He was like 300 pounds. He was not attractive. And many of the women did not look like the women there. And many of the interactions weren't there. And there's different storylines they put in to make it more interesting for other people. So The Tudors, historical fiction. The Vikings, which is actually on the History Channel, which is interesting enough. A very interesting show, but definitely historical fiction. The Vikings weren't even, they didn't even know how to write. They were illiterate. Everything was oral. So there literally is very little remnants factual artifacts that can tell us the story of the Vikings. So the definitely the authors are making up these stories, but they're historicizing them, trying to reimagine what the Vikings were like. And then we have Law and Order. So what would Law and Order be? Now, there are many genres that we did not go over that people could call Law and Order. Like it could be called a crime story, or mystery, or that sort of thing. But for our purposes, contemporary realistic fiction. It's something that happens in our real world. These crimes happen in our real world. There is a New York City. There is, I don't know exactly if there is a special victims unit, but there's some unit that deals with crimes for special victims. Then we get something else very interesting with the Hulu original series about with James Franco in it about JFK, where he goes back in time and tries to save JFK. So that's a complete genre blur of contemporary realistic fiction, fantasy, well, with the time slip, and historical fiction. So it can become really complicated. And if you're if you want to know what I mean, watch the first episode and you'll completely understand where they start in contemporary world, he time slips into the past, and then he's in the historical world. And then we have the Hunger Games. Now, what is the Hunger Games? Well, it's set in the future, and it's a dystopian kind of novel about what could be really bad in the future. And it has science in it, so it could, I would classify it as science fiction. Many people would classify it as science fiction. Next, we have Nemo, a talking fish. Talking fish equals fantasy, animal fantasy. Cinderella, as I said earlier, it's actually, the origins are from folktale. Then we have the documentary Amy, about Amy Winehouse. Now again, whenever we're talking about a documentary, everything has their own views. And while this is labeled as nonfiction because it's a documentary, there may be things in this documentary years later we find out are untrue or weren't included, or the editor took out so they could not affect the family of Amy Winehouse. So all of these things, it's very complicated, and as I said, it's a spectrum. And sometimes there are tricks when you're looking at books to figure out how to correctly qualify it. And sometimes books fit very neatly into categories. I just wanted to have you understand that sometimes they don't, and there can be a genre blur. But we will review this in class, and we will also talk more about genre and the best way to go about classifying books and to teach genre classification as well.